From the security being called on Nick Diaz and Carlos Condit's intense stare-down, to Cain Velasquez and Junior Dos Santos almost smashing heads during theirs, the UFC by far has some of the insanest stare-downs in MMA history. So let's take a trip down memory lane and talk about the most intense one between Nick Diaz versus Carlos Condit at UFC 143. Diaz, also known as the Stockton Bad Boy, has always been known for his ability to get under the skin of his opponents. And boy, did he try to do that with Carlos. Nick and Condit were both determined to come out on top, and their pre-fight behavior definitely showed that. That's just how he rolls. Anyways, Diaz went nose to nose with Condit during the pre-fight stare-down, and it was intense. But unfortunately for the fans, the fight didn't quite live up to the hype. Condit produced an exceptional performance, using his striking and movement to largely pick Diaz apart en route to a decision win. It was a smart move, but UFC fans couldn't help but feel a little disappointed that they didn't get to see an all-out brawl. But let's not forget about Diaz's history of intimidating behavior before fights. Like when he headbutted BJ Penn at the weigh-in for their 2011 bout. There is almost no possibility that Nick Diaz won't be in the face of his opponent, whether it be BJ Penn or Jack the Ripper, because he is nothing if not brave. Before their battle at UFC 137, Diaz and Penn had been very courteous of one another, but following the weigh-in, it was time to throw manners aside and determine who was the superior man. The two started to grapple, but it took them just 2 seconds for Diaz to lower his head and drive it directly into Penn's head. The move shocked fans and officials alike, forcing the UFC officials to tear the two apart. Joe Rogan's customary post-fight chat with Diaz didn't seem to matter much to him either, as he was followed the entire time by his brother Nate, who led him off the platform. Despite the lackluster fight, the stare-down will go down in UFC history as one of the most intense ones. But it wasn't the only one. Remember that stare-down between Cain Velasquez and Junior Dos Santos at UFC 166? Now that was a spectacle to witness. Former middleweight title contender Chael Sonnen has called Velasquez the scariest fighter in UFC history, and it's hard to argue with his logic. The man had a reputation and fighting ability that made his opponents tremble in their boots. And let's not forget that intimidating look. With a massive head and a mean stare, Velasquez was not one to mess with. But there was one fighter who wasn't afraid of him: Junior Dos Santos. The Brazilian knockout artist was the first man to defeat Velasquez, claiming the heavyweight title in 2011. Velasquez regained his title a year later, setting up the trilogy bout that fans were eagerly anticipating. And boy, did these two heavyweights deliver. The stare-down before the fight was the most intense in UFC history, and it didn't even happen during the pre-fight instructions. As Dos Santos was being introduced by the legendary Bruce Buffer, he had a simple routine: stare at his opponent, walk towards them, whirl his right hand around, and point down at the ground. But Velasquez wasn't having it. He stepped forward, and the two behemoths went nose to nose for a moment before JDS backed off to his corner. And it was clear that Velasquez was the more intimidating fighter, and he proved it minutes later by punishing Dos Santos for 5 rounds, en route to a TKO victory. This was the best of the best going head-to-head, and the fans couldn't get enough. Now, the stare-down that really made fans lose their minds was when Nate Diaz took off Donald "Cowboy" Cerrone's hat at a pre-fight press conference. Diaz isn't all that different from his older brother Nick when it comes to the family's natural tendency to fight. Get in their face, and nasty things frequently result. At a pre-fight news conference to advertise their fight, Diaz and Donald "Cowboy" Cerrone faced off, and the cowboy was, of course, donning his trademark cowboy hat. Nothing really happened that could have foreshadowed what happened next. The fighters exchanged some heated words, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, Diaz knocked off his opponent's hat and pushed his opponent. Now, I don't know exactly why the fighter did that, but either he didn't like Cerrone's hat or wanted one for himself, since he immediately yanked it off his head and provided a shove that prompted Dana White to step in to prevent things from becoming worse. But things did turn out for the worst for Cerrone, as Diaz followed through in the fight, pummeling the cowboy for 3 whole rounds to win. Well, if you think this was a harsh pre-fight interview, wait till you hear about the Michael Bisping versus Jorge Rivera staredown at the UFC 127 weigh-ins. So basically, Rivera had been making fun of and outright ridiculing Bisping for weeks before their fight at UFC 127 in Australia. So when the two fighters finally met at the weigh-ins, just about everyone knew it was going to become rough. After weighing in, Bisping charged at Rivera while yelling several profanities after taking a drink. Dana White had to intervene in order to prevent things from getting worse, since Jorge wouldn't back down and kept firing. Until they were ultimately escorted off the stage, the two fighters continued to yell at one another. George Carlin would have blushed from all the profanities used in that brief scene, but he would be simply stunned if he saw what went down between Michael Bisping and Vitor Belfort at the UFC on FX7 weigh-ins. Now, we all know that Bisping is a top-notch middleweight fighter and a true force to be reckoned with in the octagon. But what really sets him apart from the rest of the pack is his ability to channel his emotions and use them to fuel his battles. He's like a human rocket, blasting off into the stratosphere with every punch and kick. Take, for example, his fight against Vitor Belfort in Brazil. Bisping had some choice words for Belfort leading up to the fight, but things seemed pretty friendly when they met at the weigh-ins. Well, that just wasn't good enough for Michael. He wanted a real, genuine stare-down with Belfort. So he started yelling at him, "Come on, kid!" But Belfort, cool as a cucumber, just stared right back at him and calmly replied, "Tomorrow." And that's where Michael lost the battle before it even began. Because, as we all know, nothing gets the fighter fired up like a good old-fashioned stare-down. And when he didn't get one, he was left feeling like a deflated balloon. So what happened in the fight itself is a whole other story. Well, Belfort ended up knocking Bisping out in the second round. His taunts may have gotten him some attention and hype leading up to the fight, but they certainly didn't help him in the end. I guess that's simply how he works then. But the way GSP acted versus Nick Diaz at the UFC 158 weigh-ins was insane. Georges St-Pierre is usually as cool as the other side of the pillow, so it takes a lot to get him to open up. But if you ever need to, Nick Diaz is the man for the job. During their pre-fight conference call before the fight, Nick labeled the Canadian champion an uneducated fool. And in St-Pierre's world, that's like a whole book of yo mama jokes being unloaded. This sent St-Pierre into a fit of rage. St-Pierre promptly smacked Diaz's hand away after the two fighters engaged in a struggle that needed to be broken up before it got out of hand during the weigh-ins. That's all for the most intense stare-downs in UFC history.